Hello and welcome to, this is our first lecture for the Objects of Play lecture series, organized as part of the Play Mountain Exchange Project for the Borderlines Initiative through the Center for the Arts in Society at Carnegie Mellon University. This lecture was made possible by the Center for the Arts in Society at CMU, is free and open to the public, and is also being attended by my advanced sculpture class, Objects of Play, as well as some other folks, it looks like. So welcome Alexandra Lange virtually to our class and our school today. Thank you so much for being here. To introduce Alexandra Lange to all of you, Alexandra is a design critic, writer, and author of The Design of Childhood, How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids, published in 2018. The book is an eye-opening exploration of how children's playthings and physical surroundings affect their development. The book was supported by a grant from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, and Design of Childhood was named one of Planetizen's top 10 urban planning books of 2018. Lange's essays, reviews, and profiles have appeared in numerous design publications, including Architect, Harvard Design Magazine, Metropolis, and T Magazine, as well as in The Atlantic, New York Magazine, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. Alexandra was a 2014 Loeb Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She won a 2018 New York Press Club Award for feature reporting on teens and public space. In 2019, she was awarded a Stephen Heller Prize for Cultural Commentary by AIGA. In 2020, Alexandra was the recipient of the Stephen A. Clement Oculus Award from AIAA New York, given to architectural journalists, and she was also awarded the 2020 Brio Prize by the eponymous Swedish toy company, which honors researchers and nonprofits focused on creating a better world through play. She is also the author of Writing About Architecture, Mastering the Language of Buildings and Cities, a primer on how to read and write architecture criticism, as well as the ebook, The Dot-Com City, Silicon Valley Urbanism, which considers the message of the physical spaces of Facebook, Google, and Apple. Alexandra Lange has taught design criticism at the School of Visual Arts and New York University, and her next book, Meet Me by the Fountain, An Inside History of the Mall, will be published in June 2022. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra Lange. Sorry, everyone's muted. You just get my applause.
I see hands moving. That's very nice. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to all of you. I'm excited for your class, just like the theme, and working in this space is always very exciting to me. I gave a lecture last week that was the first lecture of a class on the design of schools, which is another chapter in my book. And I feel like this is a great position for me to be in because like one of my hopes for my book was just to kind of like lay down this groundwork for people and help you find like what interests you the most in the realm of play. And like my book, has footnotes and you can like take it where you want to go. So I hope this lecture also like gives you a taste of like all the different types of play that are out there and all the different ways that designers have already engaged with the idea of play. So I am going to share my screen and get started on my lecture. All right, you see a very beautiful playground, yes? Okay, great. So we'll get to that later. But the first American playground had no climbing bars, no seesaws, and no swings. In 1885, a group of female philanthropists decided that the immigrant children of Boston's North End needed somewhere other than the increasingly crowded and dangerous streets to play. They paid for a pile of sand to be poured into the yard of a chapel on Parmenter Street at the beginning of the summer. Playing in the dirt is the royalty of childhood, said Kate Gannett Wells, chair of the Massachusetts Emergency and Hygiene Association. The idea of a sand garden came from Germany, where such places were introduced in Berlin's public parks in 1850 as an offshoot of educator Friedrich Froebel's emphasis on the garden part of the kindergartens he created. Education reformers like Elizabeth Peabody brought the idea of early childhood education and its blocks and gardens to America. The success of the first sand pile spurred subsequent summer installations on Parmenter Street and Warrenton Street in Boston, each supervised by a matron. By 1887, there were 10 sand gardens, mostly located near the settlement houses that served recently arrived immigrant families. Country children had plenty of dirt, while wealthier city children likely had access to yards. It was poor children who needed access to free communal play spaces. As the number of such gardens increased, they began to be located in schoolyards and eventually became the property of the school board and parks department. A 10-acre outdoor gymnasium with above-ground play equipment like swings and seesaws opened in the West End in 1889, as well as 20 other playgrounds in Boston. One opened in New York that year and another in Chicago in 1892 at reformer Jane Addams's Hull House. The Hull House playground was much more elaborate, as you can see, with sand piles, swings, building blocks, a giant slide, and ball courts for older children. The repurposing of urban schoolyards for out-of-school use echoes more recent efforts in New York, among other cities, to open these spaces as weekend parks, installing trees, painting lines, and thinking about equipment to serve the needs of neighborhood adults and children. Play, which was once thought of as the exclusive province of children, is now seen as a lifetime need, while urban outdoor space remains at a premium. The pandemic has only put the need for more outdoor play space in stark relief. Playgrounds were nonsensically closed in many cities, offering children nowhere to safely socialize, while Open Streets programs only underlined the open space inequities existing in cities and sometimes created new ones. But not all play is the same. And as you think about how play space has been designed over the past century plus, it's also important to consider what kind of play it fosters and what kind of play it bounds. For the remainder of my talk today, I'm going to run you through a quick history of the American playground from the late 19th century to the present day. As you'll see, politics are always wrapped up in play. The politics of urban space and who gets it, the politics of safety and who gets to regulate it, and the politics of design and who gets to do it. As I've lectured on my book, The Design of Childhood, a number of people have asked me, could we go back to the sand garden? Should we go back to the sand garden? And I really hope that somebody tries it. I think even jaded 21st century kids would go crazy for a really giant pile of sand. So the Playground Association of America was founded on April 12, 1906, and sought to organize the efforts of reformers in cities across the US to get public financing for outdoor recreation. They were very lucky in their patronage as President Theodore Roosevelt, a known friend of the outdoors, was elected honorary president of the PAA and received the organization's leaders at the White House. In a 1907 letter to Luther Gulick, who was president of the PAA, Roosevelt wrote, "City streets are unsatisfactory playgrounds for children because of the danger, because most good games are against the law, because they are too hot in summer, and because in crowded sections of the city, they are apt to be schools of crime. Neither do small backyards nor ornamental grass plots meet the needs of any but very small children. Older children who would play vigorous games must have spaces especially set aside for them. And since play is a fundamental need, playgrounds should be provided for every child as much as schools. This means that they must be distributed over the cities in such a way as to be within walking distance of every boy and girl, as most children cannot afford to play car fare." I feel like you can see the striking modernity of that statement, since those are still the issues that we're talking about in terms of children and play. In 1887, settlement leader Charles Stover, an activist who had also advocated for public ownership of the nascent subway system, proposed a New York City law allowing the city to spend up to $1 million a year on small parks and playgrounds. But the city didn't actually spend that money until 1901. Instead, private funders created the Outdoor Recreation League, which sponsored the opening of a few small play spaces, which were typically little more than a sand pile bordered by 3 building walls, or a ball court with a few pieces of play equipment. The most famous of these early playgrounds was Seward Park on the Lower East Side, which the city finally adopted in 1903, making it the first of what are now 700 New York City playgrounds. In taking over and taking on Seward Park, the city changed its nature. A limestone and terracotta park pavilion included marble baths, an indoor gymnasium, and meeting rooms with a broad porch where mothers would sit in rocking chairs with their babies. A running track encircled the park with areas set aside for a children's garden and outdoor play equipment, divided by curving paths and plantings. Stover, who had once been the city's antagonist, became the parks commissioner. The most important contribution of the playground reformers was making play into policy. Setting aside space within the rapidly built up cities became a municipal priority and was no longer dependent on individual charities or tied to the settlement movement. The anarchic and self-built nature of the sandpile was also replaced by Beaux-Arts planning, symmetrical, geometric, with a place for each activity and every activity in its place. The architecture of these new parks and playgrounds, with its fussy separations and organized agenda, reflects the ideology of the child-saving movement, which was adopted as urban policy. Children were genuinely in danger on the city streets. In 1910, traffic accidents were the leading cause of death for children 5 to 14, and they still rank very highly up there in terms of child death. And in 1908, 500 children marched up New York's 11th Avenue, which was known as Death Avenue, carrying a coffin lid to protest the predations of the New York Central Railroad. But well-meaning adults also feared the effects of too much freedom on children. The streets were dangerous because of traffic, but they were also dangerous because of the corrupting influence of and competition for space with adults. As with the progressive era push to outlaw child labor and make primary education mandatory, there was a paternalistic and nationalist side to the playground movement's positive effects. On the playgrounds, participating in games and exercises devised by professional play leaders, American children would form a more perfect union. In order to do so, they needed a program of so-called directed activity rather than scrub play, which focused on specific skills, sports, and the building of a healthy mind and body. Team sports were the order of the day, as they forced children from disparate backgrounds to work together towards a common goal and elevated group effort over individual achievement. On the playgrounds, children of all levels of experience would be absorbed into this new sports collective. As psychologist Henry S. Curtis wrote, "There is no more rich and poor in a scout patrol than there is in a baseball game. You have to deliver the goods to get preferment. Play is the most democratic activity we know." Despite this emphasis on the melting pot nature of the playground, not every child received the same training. Women's exercises were typically held on smaller, sex-segregated outdoor gymnasiums, and women's exercises typically avoided competitive sports and were considered good for developing the figure. Black children were also provided with inferior facilities in another parallel to the early public school system, and they were more typically left with an earlier generation of play spaces like vacant lots and closed off streets. In 1921, of almost 4,000 playgrounds and recreation centers in the US, only 56 had a playground available for Black children, and only 14 cities had integrated playgrounds. Emmett J. Scott, who was the secretary treasurer at Howard University and the former secretary to Booker T. Washington, wrote an editorial in the journal The Playground in 1925 titled "Leisure Time and the Black Citizen," pointing out the lack of playgrounds for Black children in the urban North, as well as playgrounds for any children in the South. Ironically, today's play advocates see access to streets and play in vacant lots as a plus, and indeed, such activities are more likely to happen in low-income neighborhoods. Lower-income children also typically have more independence. The middle-class style of American parenting that insists on children being supervised at all times and that children play on equipment designed for their specific age group is as limiting as the paternalistic exercises and teamwork on those progressive era playgrounds. During the pandemic, many cities initiated open streets program, but only a few prioritized play rather than restaurants or other activities. Philadelphia, which has had a play streets program for more than 50 years, provided the best options that I found. The city has more than 300 participating streets every summer, each with a volunteer supervisor who closes the street to traffic from 10 to 4 and provides daily meals and snacks. During the summer of 2020, the first pandemic summer, 50 of those play streets morphed into a free distributed summer camp with food and activities for kids, jobs for teens and young adults in the city's summer workforce program, and fun for the whole community in the form of chalk, music, water, and ice cream. Volunteers running those streets received a series of kits, which were funded by the Knight Foundation and 12 other groups, including the city's pro sports teams. Separate kits contained a variety of balls. There was one with art supplies, and there was even one with cooling tools like super soakers. The city ended up ordering over 20,000 super soakers for kids. And 50 so-called super streets selected with an eye to neighborhoods with the most need got daily staffed programming. Every Friday, those streets had a dance party, Philadelphia's Parks Commissioner told me. We called upon the network of local DJs who all needed work and had a local vendor come, and we paid them to hand out free treats. Play Streets of Wonder, another nonprofit, worked literacy and math activities into the outdoor play with book wagons and arithmetic lessons incorporated into active games, bringing education and play together in these open streets. Despite the emphasis on organized activities, turn of the century playgrounds did have equipment, architectures built purely for play. Those period photographs I showed you of Seward Park showed a vast metal climbing frame with hooks for ropes and swings, and boys perched on the corners up to 20 feet off the ground. But reformers were divided over whether use of equipment did children any good. One described the psychological effect of swinging as similar to getting drunk, while Curtis derided it as unsocial as opposed to those organized games. It gives very little training, he said, to the eye or the hand or the judgment. For girls, some wrote, the swing was seen as a potential source of, quote, voluptuous excitement. The Jungle Gym has one of the most fascinating play equipment origin stories. A story which intersects with the career of progressive educator Carlton Washburn in Winnetka. Physical play was an important part of the Winnetka curriculum, and the public schools there shared a full-time PE teacher. A local patent attorney named Sebastian Hinton had grown up in Japan playing on a multi-cube bamboo frame created by his mathematician father. The frame had originally been built to teach him three-dimensional coordinates, like 3D geometry, but the children preferred climbing around on it, quote, like monkeys. Hinton met Washburn at a dinner, and the two worked on a prototype made of iron pipes that was installed at the school in 1920 and patented as a climbing structure by Jungle Gym Inc., Hinton's company, the same year. And here you can see this great illustrated patent. An improved version was made for the playground at the public Horace Mann School nearby. And when that school was demolished in 1940, the climbing frame was installed at the famous Crow Island School, designed by Eliel Saarinen and Perkins and Will, where it was in use until 2010. A 1948 advertisement for a jungle gym claimed that the structure has had, quote, more than 100 million child play hours without one serious accident. It is called the magnet of the playground and designed to meet the requirements of the Federal Housing Authority, meaning that it could be installed on the play spaces of public housing. Despite these manufacturer claims for safety, there were actually no federal regulations specifically addressing playground apparatus until the 1970s. By the end of World War II, the standard playground was well enough established that it had started to become dull, and the baby boom provoked a second expansion of public facilities for children in both the city and the new suburbs like Winnetka. While many public officials were content with the 4 S's, sandbox, slide, swing, and seesaw, post-war focus on controlling and improving the lives of children and rebuilding cities led to an explosion of new forms for outdoor play. The sand pile is an obvious precursor to the junk playgrounds of the post-war era, which set lightly supervised children loose on piles of wood and trash and dirt, and often feature great muddy sand piles of their own. The prime mover behind what came to be called the junk playground movement was an aristocrat from England, Lady Allen of Hurtwood, one of many women like those original Boston settlement house ladies who have important roles in the history of children's play. Lady Allen, Marjorie Gill Allen, had seen the first junk playground in Emdrup outside Copenhagen, where it became a refuge for youth then under German occupation. In 1945, Allen was asked to join a study group looking at European examples of what to do with orphaned and displaced children. At their stop in Copenhagen, she was taken by the head of the local Froebel Institute to see a new play space established in 1943 by landscape architect Carl Theodor Sorensen. Sorensen had set up an enclosed area of slightly more than 1 acre where a play leader provided children with scraps of wood, metal, brick, and basic tools. As Sorensen wrote, "Of all the things I have helped to realize, the junk playground is the ugliest. Yet for me, it is the best and most beautiful of my works." I love that quote because when I'm putting together slideshows, I'm always looking for like quote unquote good pictures of junk playgrounds. And I've come to realize there are no good pictures of junk playgrounds because they're not really conforming to the aesthetic ideas that you would normally put in a design slideshow. When the playground opened, the local housing association employed an adult play supervisor named John Bertelsen, and Bertelsen's diaries are excerpted in this book, The Child Right to Play, and I find them really interesting. He wrote of the first day that the junk playground opened. At 10:45 a.m., the playground opened. We began by moving all the building material in the open shed. Bricks, boards, fire posts, and cement pillars were moved to the left alongside the entrance, where building and digging started right away. The work was done by children aged 4 to 17. It went on at full speed, and all the workers were in high spirits. Dust, sweat, warning shouts, and a few scratches all created just the right atmosphere. The children's play and work ground had opened, and they knew how to take full advantage of it. Bertelsen's diary served as an early expression of the play worker philosophy, quote, "I cannot, and indeed will not, teach the children anything. At the junk playgrounds, the kids build the equipment that they need under the hands-off supervision of play workers trained to facilitate but not interfere." Allen brought Emdrup back to Britain, publishing an article titled "Why Not Use Our Bomb Sites Like This" in the Picture Post, which is a magazine similar to the American Life magazine. Her text began by critiquing the traditional playground as a place of utter boredom. She wrote, "It is little wonder that they prefer the dumps of rough wood and piles of bricks and rubbish of the bomb sites or the dangers and excitements of the traffic." Allen saw the junk playgrounds, which she eventually rechristened adventure playgrounds to make them more palatable to local planning councils, as a tool of bottom-up reconstruction for European cities. But the concept quickly traveled to the US, where McCall's magazine and the United Way established the Yard in Minneapolis in 1949. President Harry Truman visited the site soon after it opened, and McCall's put it on the cover of the magazine in 1950. Other locations with adventure playgrounds included Irvine, California, and Berkeley, California, and even the Upper East Side in Manhattan. Allen traveled to the US on a lecture tour in 1965, even meeting with Lady Bird Johnson at the White House and speaking about playgrounds at the Guggenheim Museum. While play practices have radically changed since then, the junk playground does endure. Berkeley's playground has been open continuously since the 1950s, while in Japan, which invited Lady Allen to visit in the 1970s, a small but robust network of playgrounds continues to operate. A few years ago, a group backed by the prominent play researcher Roger Hart opened a new junk playground on Governor's Island in New York City called The Yard in tribute to that original one in Minneapolis. The Yard offers open play hours on the weekend and a radical summer camp that my kids have both attended. The Playwork Primer, published in 2010 by London playworker Penny Wilson, creates a teachable method for Bertelson's approach, one that's clearly written in opposition to the playground workers of the early 20th century who taught calisthenics and teamwork, as well as the overprotective parents of today. Sample definitions in the primer include adulteration, meaning playworkers do not try to educate, train, tame, or therapeutically treat children in their time and space for play. They do not coach sports or teach art, drama, or dance, or even circus skills. They do not do activities. Another key concept for the play worker is the cloak of invisibility. A child would be stuck, perhaps needing something like a small world toy. Rather than have the child surface from her immersion in the play, Jo, the play worker, would become briefly visible. The item or support that was needed would quietly appear, and then Jo would fade away again. But how could these anarchic ideas be combined with cities' need for regulation and parents' need for control? Not everyone is comfortable with that amount of dirt and junk. Architect Richard Datner writes at the beginning of his book, Design for Play, the next best thing to a playground designed entirely by children is a playground designed by an adult, but incorporating the possibility for children to create their own places within it. As Datner began to create playgrounds for New York City in the 1960s, abiding by this principle, he had one major influence in mind. Sculptor Isamu Noguchi had been trying to build an artistic playground in New York City since the 1930s. His designs were widely seen and admired, but in the end, only one playground of his design would be realized at the scale of his ambitions, in Sapporo, Japan. Noguchi had no prior experience designing for children. His work at the time that he created Play Mountain was primarily in portrait sculpture, and he had just begun to design stage sets and costumes for modern dance choreographers, including Ruth Page and Martha Graham. Children's play, if you think about it though, is a kind of dance that they make up as they go along, aided by curbs to traverse and walls to climb. Through a social connection, Noguchi got a meeting with Robert Moses, then the city's parks commissioner, who had a mandate to increase the number of playgrounds. Moses, who would go on to open 400 playgrounds during his tenure as parks commissioner, was dismissive of the young sculptor's Play Mountain. But other influential figures in the city kept trying to help Noguchi get his dream realized. In 1950, Audrey Hess, the wife of Art News editor Thomas Hess, asked Noguchi to design a playground for a site near the UN headquarters, which was then under construction. The UN had agreed to set aside the 1 acre plot as a way of giving back to the community, and Hess, whose philanthropic interests included both art and children's causes, thought Noguchi would be able to combine the two. Noguchi prepared this plaster model with architect Julian Whittlesey, combining a contoured ground plane with his jewelry-like metal equipment, which you can see how it relates to his design for dance sets. But Moses also rejected this project. So by this time in the mid-50s, Noguchi's idea of combining sculpture and play was, if not mainstream, at least widely adopted within the philanthropic and creative communities. The Museum of Modern Art held a competition for innovative outdoor equipment, co-sponsored with the children's catalog Creative Playthings. And it produced a number of highly plausible designs, mostly in concrete, two of which you can see here. There are photos also on the MoMA website of the judges looking at all of the design. And in those photos, you can see Philip Johnson, who never showed any interest in children, like standing rather stiffly around the small models. I also love that this competition introduced sand and children into the very clean modernist spaces of MoMA. And I wish more of this equipment had made it into parks. Sydney Gordon's tunnel maze, which you can see here on the right, has been spotted in period photographs of play spaces in public housing. And it would be great for someone to actually figure out if any of these still exist and are playable. Noguchi, however, would try a third time to build a playground in New York City. In 1960, a neighborhood group was formed to try to upgrade a hilly, unsafe stretch of Riverside Park near 103rd Street. The group contacted Audrey Hess, and she contacted the artist on their behalf, assuring him that this time the local community and the new Parks Commissioner, Newbold Morris, would support an innovative design. The architect Louis Kahn was brought in as Noguchi's collaborator, and the two men had very similar ideas about integrating topography and activity, as well as not dumbing down design for children. So the two men presented their design to city officials in January 1962, but despite Hess's assurances, the reception was chilling. Morris wrote to one of the neighborhood sponsors, quote, "The very imaginative design which your people presented to us is, in our opinion, entirely too expensive in construction, too large in scale, and too dramatic in conception to be suitable for neighborhood use by mothers and small children." He could not support an unjustifiable architectural monument that would only appeal to out-of-towners and the avant-garde. However, where Noguchi failed, Dattner and his contemporary, the landscape architect Paul Friedberg, would actually succeed. In 1965, John Lindsay became mayor, and he hired Thomas Hoving as Parks Commissioner. Hoving was just 34 and had a PhD in art history, and he saw parks as part of the city's cultural life, not just as recreation facilities. And he treated them as stages for public performance and art happenings, adding dance and other kinds of activities to the parks. The Estee and Joseph Lauder Foundation offered to support the construction of a new playground north of Tavern on the Green. And after presenting rough sketches to the Committee for a Creative Playground, Dattner created a scale model of the design out of sticks and clay that could be shown to a larger group. At the end of this meeting, the Lauders made a request. Would the community raise funds to pay for a full-time play worker, since they were paying for the architect and the cost of the construction? This act of fundraising ended up being an important glue holding the community together and helped this avant-garde design make it through city planning during the process of design and construction. The finished park, which you can see the plan here, includes a series of linked play elements built of concrete and stacked cobblestones, most of them curved, arranged around a racetrack-shaped oval. Outside the play elements is a paved path ringed with benches, intended to be the domain of parents who might not want to get sand in their shoes. Inside, the play surface was all sand, split down the middle by a long sculptural water trough, which was reminiscent of some of the garden designs of the Italian modernist architect Carlo Scarpa. There are circular labyrinths and truncated cones, slide hills, and a fountain encircled by steps. A jungle gym made of logs and horizontal steel bars offers one high vantage point, and a tree house built around one of 8 existing trees offered another. Dattner also designed a building kit, a kind of cleaned up and reusable version of Emdrup's junk. These so-called play panels, which were made of 1/2-inch plywood and came in 2 sizes, could be notched together to create walls, houses, vehicles, and platforms. Short matching ladders could be propped against the side to access the roof of sculptures as they went above children's heads. These pieces were large enough to build forts and houses, while still being light enough for children to lift on their own or with one play companion. The notches meant that no additional tools or pieces were needed for assembly. And at the end of the day, the pieces were gathered and compactly stacked inside one of the pyramids by the play worker. I don't have time to go into the history of building toys today. And Isla said that you guys were going to read my chapter on blocks and building toys anyway, but I hope you can see the design connections between these play panels and something like the Eames's The Toy or a contemporary toy like Magnetiles. Children of New York were very grateful for the playground, and the architecture made an impression, as you can see in this thank you note that the architects received. Today, it is hard to imagine any of these playgrounds happening at a mass scale. It's no coincidence that the peak of American adventure playgrounds happened in the late 70s, because the 70s also brought play lawsuits. As journalist Hannah Rosen wrote in The Atlantic in 2014, it's hard to absorb how much childhood norms have shifted in just one generation. Actions that would have been considered paranoid in the 1970s, walking third graders to school, forbidding your kid to play ball in the street, going down the slide with your child in your lap, are now routine. In 1985, 8-year-old Frank Nelson was awarded $9.5 million for severe head injuries suffered when he fell from a tornado slide, something like this one, in Chicago's Hamlin Park. Nelson, whose mother was following close behind him, slipped between the railing and the stair at the top of the slide and fell to the asphalt below. The Chicago Park District, as well as the manufacturer and installer of the slide, had to pay those damages. Subsequently, the Park District removed all the 12-foot tornado slides, reducing the maximum slide height to 6 feet. And if you went around playgrounds with a tape measure today, you'll find that there are no open slides higher than that unless they are grandfathered in. Changes to the design, provision, and deployment of playground equipment after Nelson's lawsuit resulted in the publication of the first handbook for public playground safety in the 1980s, under the auspices of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. These guidelines, as well as technical requirements by the American Society for Testing of Materials, became the insurance industry standards, and manufacturers rushed to create equipment that fell within the guidelines, allowing municipalities to limit their risk, which resulted in the mass market playscape for children, where they might encounter the same equipment clearly marked for the ages for which it's intended wherever they go. So it isn't just the slide that's been tamed. The sandbox has also been demonized as unclean, as it may be visited after hours by vermin or used as a litter box by cats. In December 2016, the New York Times ran an article showing children playing on one of the city's last seesaws in Riverside Park. Seesaws were on 55% of American playgrounds in 2000 and only 7% by 2004. 20 years ago, the Times ran a similar story about the disappearance of monkey bars. It was the height of the bars that doomed them, up to 10 feet, as well as the number of bars a falling body might hit on the way down. I recommend this book, Once Upon a Playground, if you want to see more so-called dangerous examples from the past. Some holdouts remain, however. There's a playground by Fort Tryon Park that has what I believe to be one of the first generation of jungle gyms. I think that because you can see that the steel bars are not welded together, but held together with ties that kind of look like the strings that you would wrap around a bamboo structure to hold the interstices in place. So sand, junk, and Dattner's play panels all fall into the category of loose parts, a term invented in 1971 by Simon Nicholson, an architect, in an essay called How Not to Cheat Children. Nicholson, who had been inspired by the junk playgrounds of London, wrote, "In any environment, both the degree of inventiveness and creativity and the possibility of discovery are directly proportional to the number and kinds of variables in it. Children's environments," he went on to say, "are clean, static, and impossible to play around with. What has happened is that adults in the form of professional artists, architects, landscape architects and planners have had all the fun playing with their own materials, concept, and planning alternatives. And then builders have had all the fun building the environments out of real materials. And thus has all of the fun and creativity been stolen. As you go forward as designers, researchers, artists, and as parents, I think we all need to listen to Nicholson and think about some of the through lines in more than a century of playground design. We need to think about how to provide the space for play and the tools of play, not to mention the company of other like-minded children to play with, without stealing all the fun, creativity, and discovery for ourselves. Thanks so much for having me, and I am happy to answer questions.